Madam President, 20 years ago when I was elected to the United States Senate, a group of people came to me and asked me to sponsor a bill. It was a bill that had been sponsored many times by Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey. He retired shortly before I arrived. The bill related to the Utah wilderness. I remember saying to those who approached me, "This isn't my state, it's the state of Utah." And they said, "Well, this is a bill which we're having some controversy with when it comes to the Utah congressional delegation." And secondly, I said, "It's a wilderness bill about a part of the world that I've never seen. I don't feel right introducing it." Well, they said, "Why don't you come out and look at it?" And I did, just a few weeks later. My wife and I went out and took a look at the Red Rocks Wilderness area in Utah. I will tell you, initially, as a Midwesterner, when I looked at this stark landscape, I looked around thinking, what are we trying to preserve here? But then I took a closer look, which everyone should, and found a unique part of America, a wilderness area which can't be found anywhere else, and a wilderness area which boasts archaeological and historic and environmental significance way beyond what many people in the rest of the lower 48 might appreciate. Today I'm reintroducing the America's Red Rock Wilderness Act. It would safeguard 9.2 million acres of Bureau of Land Management land in Utah as wilderness, some of the last great wild places in the lower 48. Throughout my time in the Senate, I've worked with the committed volunteers of the Utah Wilderness Coalition to protect this stunning, fragile desert landscape. These unique lands are rich in archaeological resources and provide a habitat for rare plants and species. They offer unparalleled research, educational, and recreational opportunities for scientists, teachers, outdoor enthusiasts, and families. The Bureau of Land Management has confirmed that the vast majority of the lands meet the qualifications for a wilderness designation. However, despite their pristine condition, their historical significance, these lands are threatened by oil and gas development as well as rampant off-road vehicle use. Although these activities are appropriate in some places, they don't belong in such a fragile landscape. Designating these lands as wilderness would safeguard wildlife, protect ancestral lands, help mitigate climate change, and provide access to future generations of hunters, anglers, hikers, boaters, and lovers of the natural world. Now, last December, President Obama took an important step in protecting some of southern Utah's fragile lands by designating the Bears Ears National Monument, which contains some of the lands that would be protected by my Red Rocks bill. The 1.35 million acre swath of land covers forested mesas and red rock canyons, and the designation protected the region's abundant Native American cultural resources. The monument contains well over 100,000 cultural and archaeological sites. Let me say that again. Over 100,000 cultural and archaeological sites, including ancient cliff dwellings, granaries, burial sites, and kivas, as well as spectacular pictographs and petroglyphs strewn upon rock walls and boulders all across the region. Artifacts range from 700 to 12,000 years old, providing tribes with an incredible insight into the shared history of their ancestral homeland, bolstering their deep spiritual connection to the land itself. The Bears Ears Monument, designated by President Obama, is the first monument of its kind to be proposed and advocated by a united coalition of 5 tribes who sought its protection because of its importance in their respective culture. In total, 30 Native American tribes with ancestral, historical, and contemporary ties to the Bears Ears region supported the designation. The Tribal Coalition's original Bears Ears proposal was 1.9 million acres. You see it over here. Slightly larger than the 1.35 million acre designation by President Obama. Now, many in the Utah delegation, including one of my colleagues in the Senate, have raised concerns about President Obama's decision to protect this area and even the size of the designation. One of the critics of the size of the designation is the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, Rob Bishop. But last Congress, before President Obama designated the Bears Ears region a national monument, the same Chairman Bishop introduced a bill that would have protected part of the Bears Ears region while opening other areas of land for oil and gas development. Look at the two here in comparison. Chairman Bishop's proposal protected 1.28 million acres, only 17,500 acres smaller than the area protected by President Obama. As you can see from these maps, the areas protected by Chairman Bishop's Public Lands Initiative are not that much different than the areas protected by the Bears Ears Monument. To argue that the designation is so much larger than anyone had anticipated is to ignore what the chairman submitted in his own legislation last year. And both are much smaller than what the tribes originally requested, which is the third map here. Despite that, Utah's congressional delegation has called the current area, quote, well beyond the areas in need of protection. And they pushed President Trump to consider shrinking or overturning this wilderness designation, monument designation. Yet Utah's Salt Lake Tribune called Utah politicians' determination to rescind these designations, quote, blindness. Let me quote the Salt Lake Tribune, quote, that blindness can be sourced to Utah's one-party political system that has given us leaders who are out of touch with their constituents, end of quote. They then continue and say, quote, the Bears Ears Monument may be with us forever, and there's no bucket of gold waiting if it does go away. The presidential proclamation bent far toward the same boundaries and shared management that Congressman Bishop pursued with his Public Lands Initiative. They saw the same maps and said, why is this acceptable and this objectionable? Today, President Trump is planning to sign an executive order. It's going to call on the Department of Interior to review previous national monument designations under the Antiquities Act. While the president's executive order will target the Bears Ears Monument first, the order is going to go well beyond Utah and consider changes to all of the national monuments that have been designated since 1996, more than 50 different sites. These are areas designated National Monument Protected Areas by Republican and Democratic presidents with bipartisan support. And yet President Trump is going to insist with his new order that he can review and change every single one of them. Let me tell you the list of places and sites of great cultural significance that could be impacted. A portion of the Sequoia National Forest in California, Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Park in Maryland, African Burial Ground National Monument in New York, and in my home state of Illinois, the Pullman National Monument. It's rare for any national monument designation to be changed by another president. It happened once. The last time a president used the Antiquities Act to adjust the borders of a national monument was over a century ago in 1915. Then President Woodrow Wilson shrunk Washington State's Mount Olympus National Monument so that they could harvest more timber resources from this monument land. Well, a lot has changed since 1915, including our views on conservation. But attacks on conservation seem to have remained consistent. One of our greatest conservation presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, a proud Republican, I might add, faced a great deal of opposition to his designation of a national monument that most of us are familiar with, the Grand Canyon. Most Americans can't imagine our country without the iconic Grand Canyon because it's truly a national treasure. But at the time of its 1908 designation by President Roosevelt, groups were opposed to protecting that area. For years after its designation, oil and gas miners fought additional protections for the Grand Canyon. The attacks on the Bears Ears designation doesn't seem all that different from the attacks on the Grand Canyon. But the attacks on the Bears Ears Monument also attacked the Native people who have worked so hard to get this area protected. Let's be very honest. When we look at how Native Americans were treated by our government and the settlers, we certainly look back with some shame and some embarrassment. What the tribes are asking for here is a protection of areas that are special significance to them and special significance to the environmental legacy which we should leave to future generations. The president's decision to review these national monuments puts the future of these resources in jeopardy and threatens our culture, history, and heritage. And if President Donald Trump decides to use the Antiquities Act to reverse one of these monuments, he's going to be treading uncharted waters. Never before has a president used the Antiquities Act to repeal a national monument. For what purpose? For oil and gas exploration? For off-the-road vehicle use? These monuments themselves help promote tourism and outdoor recreation. Regions with national monuments saw increased employment and personal income growth, exactly the opposite of what the critics promised. Specifically, rural counties in the West with protected lands saw jobs increase by 345% over areas without protected lands. 345%. Despite the opposition from Utah's elected officials, many in the state, including the tribes, want to protect those areas, and I want to help them. Teddy Roosevelt once said, and I quote, "It is also vandalism wantonly to destroy or to permit the destruction of what is beautiful in nature, whether it be a cliff, a forest, or a species of mammal or bird." President Teddy Roosevelt said, "Here in the United States, we turn our rivers and streams into sewers and dumping grounds. We pollute the air, we destroy forests, and exterminate fishes, birds, and mammals, not to speak of vulgarizing charming landscapes with hideous advertisements. But at last it looks as if our people were awakening." End of quote. That was said by that Republican president over a century ago. Since Teddy Roosevelt's time, we've made progress in protecting our lands and waters. But these recent attacks and this recent executive order by President Donald Trump show that we still have a long way to go. I urge this administration, this Republican administration, to heed the words of Teddy Roosevelt. Carefully consider the legacy that they will leave to future generations. It would be foolish not to protect Bears Ears and other monuments, just as it would have been foolish to listen to the critics and refuse to protect the Grand Canyon. These monuments are for all of us, and we must ensure that they remain in their natural condition for current and future generations to enjoy.